I never imagined the loudest sound I'd ever hear would come from absolute silence. Not the silence after a gunshot, not the silence inside a funeral home. The silence that followed my husband laughing as he held my late grandmother's handwritten will in his hands. He didn't even bother reading the whole thing. He glanced at the first page, tossed it onto our kitchen counter, leaned back in his chair, and laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "All that crying over your grandmother," Spencer said between chuckles. "And this is what she left you? That's pathetic." He looked me straight in the eyes. "I've seen garage sales with bigger inheritances." His words cut deeper than he could ever understand. My grandmother wasn't just family. She had raised me after my parents died when I was 14. She worked 2 jobs for years, skipped vacations, wore the same winter coat for almost a decade, and somehow still found a way to make every birthday feel magical. Every lesson I knew about dignity, kindness, and resilience came from her. And Spencer had reduced her final gift to a joke. He never asked what was actually in the estate. He never asked why my grandmother had insisted the attorney wait 30 days before revealing everything. He assumed the old farmhouse outside Burlington, Vermont, was worthless. He assumed the faded pickup truck belonged in a scrapyard. He assumed the small checking account listed in the will represented everything she'd left behind. Then he smiled with that familiar look of superiority and said something that changed my life forever. "I guess now you'll finally stop pretending your family was special." I looked at him for a long moment. I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to tell him that for the past 3 years, every collection notice that mysteriously disappeared from our mailbox, every overdue loan that somehow got paid just before the bank called, every credit card balance that magically dropped without him knowing why, every financial disaster he'd hidden from me because he thought I was too naive to understand, I had quietly taken care of every single one. Not because he deserved it, because I believed marriage meant protecting each other, even when only one person was doing the protecting. He thought he was the one carrying our family. He had no idea I was the reason his credit hadn't collapsed. He had no idea I had emptied my own savings more than once to keep collectors from taking his truck. He had no idea I'd spent countless nights negotiating payment plans while he slept peacefully beside me. And he definitely had no idea that the inheritance he had just mocked was about to reveal a truth so devastating that everything he believed about money, power, and our marriage would collapse in front of everyone who had ever doubted me. I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence is the most dangerous answer a person can give. And Spencer was about to learn exactly why. Before we dive deeper into the story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. If stories about betrayal, shocking secrets, and unforgettable justice are your kind of stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because every story here reminds us that the truth always finds its way to the surface. People think disrespect begins with shouting. It doesn't. It begins with small moments that slowly convince you your feelings don't matter. The first time Spencer Bradford made me feel small wasn't when he laughed at my grandmother's will. It was almost 8 years earlier, just 3 months after we got married. We were standing in the kitchen of our first home, unpacking wedding gifts. I had carefully wrapped my grandmother's old cast-iron skillet in newspaper because it was the one thing she insisted I take when I moved out. She always said, "A good pan can feed a family for generations." Spencer held it in both hands, examined the worn surface, and wrinkled his nose. "You actually brought this old thing?" "It belonged to my grandmother." "So?" I smiled anyway. "It means something to me." He shrugged. "It belongs in a museum." I laughed because I thought he was joking. Looking back now, I realize he wasn't. That skillet stayed hidden in the back of the cabinet for years because every time I used it, he'd ask why I didn't buy something newer. It wasn't about the pan. It was about everything I loved that he couldn't assign a dollar value to. At first, I convinced myself he simply came from a different kind of family. His parents believed appearances mattered more than memories. Every holiday looked like a magazine cover. Perfect decorations, perfect clothes, perfect smiles. Meanwhile, my grandmother believed holidays were about whoever showed up hungry. She never cared whether the plates matched. She cared whether everyone left feeling loved. Spencer admired polished marble countertops. My grandmother admired handwritten recipes stained with decades of use. I spent years trying to make those two worlds fit together. Only one of them ever made room for the other. The hardest part wasn't his criticism. It was how normal it became. Whenever I talked about my childhood, he'd interrupt with stories about people who had done better. Whenever I shared an idea, he'd explain why it wouldn't work. Whenever something good happened to me, somehow the conversation found its way back to him. Little by little, I stopped sharing things. It was easier, less exhausting. Around our 4th anniversary, Spencer announced he wanted to start his own construction supply business. "It'll change everything," he said. "I know it will." I believed him. I always believed him. When the bank wanted more collateral than we had, he came home frustrated. They don't understand vision. I sat beside him at the dining room table while he buried his face in his hands. "What do we do?" "I'll figure it out." But he didn't. A week later, I discovered he'd opened 3 business credit cards without mentioning them. Then came a personal loan. Then another. Then equipment leases. Every document carried his signature. None carried mine. Whenever I asked about the balances, he'd wave me away. "It's temporary. Business requires risk. You wouldn't understand." That last sentence became his favorite. "You wouldn't understand." Maybe he thought because I worked as a library archivist, I didn't understand finances. The truth was, I understood numbers better than he ever would. My grandmother had taught me to track every penny from the day I earned my first paycheck bagging groceries in high school. She used to sit with me at her tiny kitchen table every Friday evening. We wrote every expense in a notebook. Every dollar had a purpose before it was spent. She'd smile and say, "Money isn't power, Abby. Peace is power. Money just helps you protect it." I carried that lesson into adulthood. Without Spencer knowing, I built emergency savings. I invested carefully. I avoided debt whenever possible. Then his business began falling apart. Customers paid late. Several large contracts disappeared. Suppliers demanded immediate payment. Collection letters started arriving almost every week. At first, I left them untouched. I assumed Spencer was handling everything. Until one afternoon I answered our front door. A man in a gray suit asked for Spencer. When I explained he was at work, the man's expression changed. He handed me an envelope. "Please ask your husband to contact us immediately." The envelope contained a notice threatening legal action. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper for almost an hour. That evening I placed it in front of Spencer. He barely looked at it. "I've got it handled." "You don't seem to." His jaw tightened. "You don't trust me?" "I trust honesty." For a second, I thought he'd finally tell me everything. Instead, he stood up, grabbed the envelope, and tossed it into the trash. I said I've got it. That night, after he fell asleep, I quietly retrieved the notice from the garbage. Amount owed made my stomach drop. It wasn't one missed payment. It was months of ignored notices. Interest, penalties, attorney fees. Enough to destroy us if nothing changed. The next morning, while Spencer was at work, I called the creditor myself. By the end of the week, I'd negotiated a payment arrangement using money I'd spent years saving. I never told him. Not because I wanted recognition, because I wanted to protect our marriage. I thought that was what love looked like. I didn't know that saving someone from the consequences of their choices sometimes teaches them nothing at all. And that first payment was only the beginning. Before long, I wasn't just rescuing our finances, I was rescuing him from debts he never intended for me to discover. If someone had asked me back then whether Spencer loved me, I would have answered yes without hesitation. Love isn't always obvious when you're living inside it. Sometimes it disguises itself as excuses. Sometimes it hides behind hope, and sometimes it convinces you that carrying someone else's burdens is simply part of being a good wife. For nearly 3 years, that was exactly what I believed. Every time Spencer assured me another contract was about to turn things around, I chose faith over doubt. Every time he promised the business was only going through a rough patch, I wanted to believe him. But numbers don't care about promises. Numbers tell the truth. And every month, the truth became harder to ignore. I developed a routine Spencer never knew existed. On my lunch break, I would drive across town instead of eating with my coworkers. Some days I met with creditors. Other days I sat in the office of our bank manager, Scott Brennan, trying to keep another account from falling into default. Scott eventually recognized me the moment I walked through the doors. "Mrs. Bradford," he'd say gently, "let's see what we can do today." He never judged me. He simply slid the paperwork across his desk and helped me understand exactly how much damage had been done. One afternoon, After reviewing yet another overdue business loan, he removed his glasses and looked at me carefully. I hope you don't mind me asking. What is it? Does your husband know you're the one making these payments? I smiled, but it felt heavy. He doesn't need the extra pressure. Scott was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I didn't fully understand until much later. Helping someone is generous. Hiding the consequences from them is something entirely different. His words followed me all the way home. Even so, I kept paying. I told myself I was protecting our future. I cut every unnecessary expense. I packed my lunch instead of buying it. I stopped replacing clothes unless they were beyond repair. I skipped salon appointments. I sold a few pieces of jewelry I'd inherited from an aunt. None of it felt like a sacrifice. It felt like responsibility. Meanwhile, Spencer continued living as though everything was under control. He bought expensive watches because, according to him, successful businessmen had to look successful. He upgraded his truck before the old one was even paid off. He took clients to expensive restaurants to maintain appearances. Whenever I suggested slowing down, he'd laugh. You have to spend money to make money. I often wondered if he believed those words or simply enjoyed saying them. Then came the credit cards. Not one, not two, 5. I found out by accident. A stack of envelopes had been delivered while Spencer was away on a business trip. Most were marked "Final Notice." My hands trembled as I opened them. Different banks, different balances, different due dates, all carrying the same warning: immediate action required. That evening, I spread every statement across the dining room table. For the first time, I understood the full picture. Our financial problems weren't temporary. They were catastrophic. When Spencer returned 2 days later, I waited until dinner was over before speaking. We need to talk. He barely looked up from his phone. About what? I placed the statements in front of him. He sighed dramatically. I was wondering when you'd find those. You were wondering? They're business expenses. They're personal credit cards. They're connected. They're maxed out. He leaned back in his chair, as though I were overreacting. You worry too much. No, Spencer, I could hear my own heartbeat. You don't worry enough. For a split second, I saw irritation flash across his face. Then he smiled. Not warmly, patiently. The kind of smile someone gives a child who doesn't understand adult conversations. You've always been cautious, Abby. Cautious? That's why we balance each other out. No. I shook my head. Balance means both people carry weight. His smile disappeared. Without another word, he gathered every statement, shoved them back into their envelopes, and walked upstairs. The conversation was over. At least for him. The next morning, I called every credit card company myself. Some accounts were already close to legal action. Others had accumulated months of interest and penalties. By the end of that week, I had emptied nearly half of my emergency savings to stop the immediate damage. Again. He never asked where the money came from. He simply noticed the phone calls stopped. Looking back, that should have hurt me more than it did. Not because he accepted my help, because he never wondered how the problems kept disappearing. It was as though he expected life to clean up after him. A month later, something happened that should have opened my eyes. I came home early because the library closed for a maintenance inspection. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Spencer's truck wasn't there. That wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was another vehicle parked across the street. A dark sedan. Inside sat a man watching our house. The moment he noticed me, he stepped out. Mrs. Bradford? Yes. He introduced himself as a process server. I've been trying to locate your husband. The words made my stomach tighten. He handed me a sealed envelope. I'd appreciate it if you asked him to contact the court. The court. Not another creditor. A lawsuit. I thanked him, walked inside, locked the front door, and stood in the hallway staring at the envelope for several minutes before opening it. The lawsuit wasn't small. One of Spencer's suppliers claimed he had accepted thousands of dollars worth of materials without paying the final invoices. The filing included emails, contracts, delivery confirmations, everything. For the first time since we were married, I couldn't convince myself there had been a misunderstanding. This wasn't bad luck. This was a pattern. And patterns don't disappear on their own. That evening, Spencer walked through the front door smiling. You won't believe it, he said. I think we're finally turning a corner. I looked at the legal documents in my hands. Then I looked back at the man I had spent years protecting. I realized I didn't recognize him anymore. And I had no idea that while I was quietly paying off his past, my late grandmother had already put a plan in motion that would expose every lie Spencer had ever told. The day of my grandmother's funeral was cold enough to make every breath sting. The church was filled with people whose lives she had quietly changed. Former students she had tutored for free, neighbors she had fed when times were hard, single mothers she had babysat for without accepting a single dollar. I listened as one person after another described her generosity. Each story made me smile through my tears. Spencer looked impatient. He checked his watch. He answered emails during the reception. More than once, I caught him wandering outside to take business calls while everyone else shared memories of the woman who had raised me. When it was finally time to leave, he squeezed my shoulder. "You okay?" I nodded. "I'll survive." "Good." He kissed my forehead. "Tomorrow we'll have to deal with the estate. Not celebrate her life. Not honor her memory. The estate." That single word bothered me more than I admitted. The following morning, we met attorney Julia Mercer in her office, overlooking Lake Champlain. Julia had known my grandmother for nearly 20 years. The moment she saw me, she wrapped me in a hug. "She loved you beyond words." "I know," Julia smiled sadly. "She made sure you would never doubt it." Spencer remained standing. "So, what's involved here?" Julia looked at him politely. "We'll review the will." She opened a thick folder. Most of what she read didn't surprise me. My grandmother donated money to local charities. She left treasured keepsakes to lifelong friends. Her church received several family heirlooms she'd promised years earlier. Then Julia paused. "The remainder of the estate will transfer to Abigail under one condition." Spencer leaned forward. "What condition?" Julia looked directly at me. "Your grandmother instructed me to delay the final transfer for 30 days after her passing." Spencer frowned. "Why?" "I'm not authorized to explain that until the waiting period ends." He laughed under his breath. "That's unusual." Julia nodded. "It is." She slid an envelope across the desk. "This letter is also for Abigail." Spencer reached toward it. Julia calmly placed her hand over the envelope. "I'm sorry." She smiled professionally. "Your grandmother's instructions were very specific. This letter is to be opened by Abigail alone." I noticed the slightest irritation cross Spencer's face. For someone who insisted the inheritance couldn't possibly matter, he suddenly seemed very interested in every detail. The drive home was painfully quiet. About halfway there, Spencer finally spoke. "I don't understand old people." I stared out the passenger window. "What do you mean?" "They always think they're leaving behind some huge mystery." He chuckled. "I guarantee there's nothing important in that letter." I didn't answer. He continued anyway. "I mean, let's be realistic." He tapped the steering wheel. "Your grandmother lived in the same farmhouse for 40 years. She wasn't wealthy. She didn't own some giant corporation. So whatever this secret is," he shrugged, "it's probably sentimental." That word again. Sentimental. As though love, sacrifice, and memory had no value because they couldn't be measured on a balance sheet. That night, after Spencer went to bed, I sat alone in the living room holding the sealed envelope. My grandmother's handwriting covered the front. "For my Abby." I traced the letters with my thumb but couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. It felt like hearing her voice one final time. I wasn't ready for goodbye. The next few weeks became strangely busy. Spencer grew more anxious every day. Creditors called more frequently. His business account remained overdrawn. He became short-tempered over the smallest inconveniences. One evening, he threw his phone onto the couch. "This is ridiculous. What happened?" "Another supplier." "What did they want?" He rolled his eyes. "Money." I waited. He didn't elaborate. "Are you going to pay them?" "They can wait." I looked at him carefully. "They've probably been waiting already." He stood. "You always assume I'm doing something wrong." "I assume people deserve to be paid." Instead of answering, he grabbed his keys. "I'm going out." "Where?" "To fix things." The front door slammed behind him. I sat there for several minutes before my phone rang. It was Scott Brennan. "Mrs. Bradford." His voice sounded unusually serious. "I'm sorry to bother you at home." "It's all right. I thought you should know." He hesitated. "Your husband applied for another business loan today." I closed my eyes. "Was it approved?" "No." Relief washed over me. Then Scott added quietly, "He attempted to use property listed under your name as additional collateral." I froze. What? It couldn't proceed because the ownership documentation wasn't complete. I gripped the phone tighter. "He didn't have my permission." "I know." Scott lowered his voice. "I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it somewhere else." After we hung up, I couldn't move. The room suddenly felt smaller. Spencer hadn't simply hidden debts. He had tried to secure more money using assets that belonged to me. Assets he assumed he would eventually control. That night he came home unusually cheerful. "You'll never guess." "What?" "I think things are finally looking up." I searched his face. He looked completely relaxed. No guilt, no hesitation, no sign that he'd spent the day trying to gamble with property that wasn't his. I realized then that I had spent years protecting a man who never once considered protecting me. 3 days later, the 30-day waiting period ended. Julia Mercer called. "Abigail." "Yes?" "It's time." My heart skipped. "Time for what?" "Your grandmother wanted you to come to my office." "Alone." There was a brief pause before she added words that sent chills through my entire body. "And bring the unopened letter." I looked across the room at Spencer, who was scrolling through his phone, completely unaware that the secret he'd laughed at was finally about to be revealed. For the first time since my grandmother died, I had the unmistakable feeling that she had seen the truth about my marriage long before I ever did. I barely slept the night before my appointment with Julia Mercer. The unopened letter sat on my nightstand, exactly where I'd left it nearly a month earlier. Every time I reached for it, I stopped. My grandmother had asked me to wait. She had never asked for much in her life. The least I could do was honor her final wish. The next morning, I told Spencer I needed to stop by the attorney's office. He barely looked up from his laptop. "Finally." His tone was almost excited. "Let's see what all this mystery is about. I have to go alone." His fingers froze over the keyboard. "What do you mean?" "That's what my grandmother requested." He laughed. "That's ridiculous." "It was her decision. So what am I supposed to do?" "Wait." His smile disappeared. "I don't like being left out of things." I looked at him quietly. "Neither do I." But I didn't say the words out loud. Instead, I picked up my purse and left. Julia greeted me warmly before leading me into a private conference room. The same folder from 30 days earlier rested neatly on the table. "So," she said softly, "are you ready?" I nodded. "I think so." She smiled. "Open the letter." My hands trembled as I carefully broke the seal. The familiar handwriting instantly brought tears to my eyes. "My dearest Abby, if you're reading this, then I've had to leave you before I was ready. Please don't waste your tears on wishing for one more conversation. Instead, listen to this one." The room became perfectly still. I could almost hear her voice. "You have always believed the best in people. It is one of your greatest gifts. But it is also the reason I worried about you. If you are still married when this letter is opened, I need you to hear something very carefully. Real love never asks one person to carry every burden while the other carries only pride." My heart stopped. I looked up at Julia. She simply nodded, encouraging me to continue. "During the past several years, I noticed things you tried very hard to hide. You smiled when you were exhausted. You defended your husband even when he embarrassed you. You insisted everything was fine when I could see fear behind your eyes. You thought you were protecting me. The truth is, I was trying to protect you." Tears blurred the page. My grandmother had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Then I reached the paragraph that changed everything. "Several years ago, I sold a piece of family property your grandfather and I owned. The money was invested quietly. It has remained untouched ever since. I instructed Julia to keep everything confidential until 30 days after my passing, because I wanted the truth about the people around you to reveal itself before anyone learned what I had left behind." I stared at the page. Invested? Untouched? Julia slid a tissue toward me. I barely noticed. The letter continued. "Money changes people, but the promise of money changes them even faster. If anyone mocks what they believe you inherited, if anyone suddenly becomes kind after learning the truth, you will know exactly who they are. Never confuse affection for access." Those words echoed inside my head. I kept reading. "The farmhouse was never the inheritance. It was only the address where your memories lived. Your inheritance has been waiting somewhere else. Julia already knows everything. Trust her. By the time I reached the signature, I couldn't stop crying. Love always, Grandma Evelyn. I folded the letter carefully and looked at Julia. I don't understand. She opened the thick folder in front of her. I think you will. She removed several documents. Then she turned the first page toward me. It was an investment statement. My eyes immediately found the balance. I stopped breathing. The number didn't seem real. Surely I had read it wrong. I blinked, then read it again. It was still there. Years of careful investments, dividends, growth, everything my grandmother had quietly built over decades. My voice cracked. This can't be right. Julia smiled through misty eyes. It is. My grandmother was much wiser than most people realized. I shook my head. She never spent money on herself. No. Julia smiled. She spent it on building your future. I covered my mouth. All those years. The old coat. The second-hand furniture. The tiny farmhouse. Everyone assumed she had very little. She had simply chosen a simple life. Then Julia handed me one final document. This is something your grandmother insisted you receive last. I looked down. It was a ledger. Every page contained handwritten notes. Payments, dates, names. I frowned. What is this? Julia leaned forward. Your grandmother knew your husband was struggling financially. I swallowed. She also knew you were helping him. My heart raced. How? Julia sighed gently. Because she occasionally deposited money into your personal account. My eyes widened. The account I used to pay Spencer's debts. I stared at her in disbelief. No. Julia nodded. Your grandmother figured out what you were doing years ago. The tears returned. She never said anything. She respected your choices. Julia paused. But she wanted to make sure your kindness never left you with nothing. I couldn't speak. Every payment I thought had emptied my savings. Every sacrifice I believed I had made alone. My grandmother had quietly restored what I'd given away without ever asking for credit. Even after her death, she was still protecting me. Then Julia's expression became serious. There's something else. She reached for another folder. It's about your husband's finances. I felt my stomach tighten. What about them? Julia looked directly into my eyes. Abigail, your grandmother wasn't the only person who knew Spencer had been hiding the truth. And what Julia showed me next would completely destroy the life Spencer had spent years pretending to build. I stared at the folder in front of Julia, afraid to touch it. For years, I had prepared myself for bad news. I had learned how to stay calm when another bill arrived. How to negotiate with creditors without letting my voice shake. How to smile through dinners with Spencer's friends while wondering whether our electricity would still be on the following month. But something about Julia's expression told me this wasn't another unpaid invoice. This was something far worse. She slowly opened the folder. I spent the last month reviewing several financial records connected to your grandmother's estate. I frowned. What does that have to do with Spencer? Everything. She slid a copy of a loan agreement toward me. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Then I saw my name, not in the borrower section, in the collateral section. My heart skipped. What is this? Julia folded her hands. About 8 months ago, your husband applied for a large commercial loan. I know he applied. You don't know everything. She pointed to the paperwork. He listed property he expected to acquire through your grandmother's estate. I felt cold. He couldn't have. He did. But the estate hadn't even transferred. Julia nodded. Exactly. I looked closer. Attached to the application was a financial projection. Spencer had already estimated the value of my inheritance. He had already written detailed plans for how he intended to spend it. New warehouse, luxury office, additional equipment, vehicle upgrades. Not $1 was allocated to our future. Not $1 was allocated to our future. Not $1 was intended to repay the debts I had been quietly covering. He had already spent money that wasn't his. Without ever asking me, without even knowing whether I wanted to share it, my hands trembled as I turned another page. There was an email. From Spencer. Once my wife receives the inheritance, repayment won't be a problem. Another. The property will eventually be under our control. Our, not mine, not hers, ours. Except I had never been part of those conversations. Julia let me read in silence. When I finally looked up, my voice barely worked. How did the bank approve this? They didn't. Why? Because they requested verification from my office. She paused. Your grandmother had already placed legal protections around every major asset. I closed my eyes. Even then, she had anticipated this, Julia continued. Spencer was informed that he couldn't use assets belonging to an estate he did not own. So he stopped? No. She handed me another document. He simply tried somewhere else. There it was again. Another application, another lender, another attempt, then another. Each one using the same promise. My wife's inheritance. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The inheritance he had mocked in my kitchen. The inheritance he claimed was worthless. Was the very inheritance he had spent months trying to borrow against. The hypocrisy made me sick. I don't understand. Julia looked at me sadly. He never believed it was worthless. What? He believed you didn't know its value. The words landed like a hammer. He hadn't laughed because he thought it meant nothing. He had laughed because he wanted me to believe it meant nothing. If I believed that, maybe I would sign whatever papers he placed in front of me. Maybe I would never question where the money went. Maybe I would trust him completely. I suddenly remembered something from almost a year earlier. Spencer had come home carrying several documents. I need your signature. What are they? Just updated business paperwork. I had reached for a pen, then my grandmother called. We talked for nearly an hour. By the time I hung up, Spencer had become impatient. Forget it. I'll handle it another way. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I wondered what those papers had really been. Julia seemed to read my mind. Did he ever ask you to sign blank forms? I nodded slowly. A few times. Did you? No. A faint smile crossed her face. That may have saved you. I leaned back, exhausted. The room suddenly felt too small. For years, I had blamed poor business decisions, poor planning, bad luck. Now I was beginning to understand something much darker. Spencer hadn't simply been irresponsible. He had been calculating. Every decision had one assumption behind it. That I would always clean up the mess. That I would always forgive him. That eventually my inheritance would become his escape. He never imagined I would learn the truth before he gained access to a single dollar. Julia reached into the folder one last time. There is one more thing. I don't know if I want to hear it. You need to. She placed a thin envelope on the table. It arrived this morning. The sender was a debt collection law firm. I frowned. Why are they sending this to me? Because your husband listed you as a financial contact. I opened it carefully. The amount owed was staggering. Far larger than anything I'd seen before. My breathing became shallow. This can't be right. Julia nodded grimly. It is. Then I noticed the date. The loan had been taken out just 6 weeks earlier. That meant Spencer had borrowed even more money after my grandmother died, before her estate had even been settled. He was already gambling on an inheritance that wasn't his, and if he failed, the collectors would come looking for me next. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't feel fear, I felt clarity. I had spent years saving Spencer from consequences he never intended to face. I wasn't going to do it again. As I gathered the documents, Julia asked quietly, "What are you going to do?" I folded my grandmother's letter and slipped it carefully into my purse. Then I stood. For the first time in a very long time, I looked out the window toward the parking lot where my car was waiting. I'm going to let the truth collect its own debt. I had no idea that when I walked through my front door that evening, Spencer would greet me with the biggest smile I'd seen in years. Because someone had just called him with news he thought would make him rich. He didn't realize the fortune he believed he had already claimed had never belonged to him in the first place. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, Spencer was already standing on the front porch. He hadn't looked that happy in months. He was practically glowing. The moment I stepped out of the car, he hurried toward me with a grin stretched across his face. There you are. His excitement felt strange. Too rehearsed. Too eager. What happened? I asked. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders, something he hadn't done in weeks. I knew your grandmother had more than everyone thought. I looked at him carefully. Oh? He laughed. I got a call this afternoon. My heart skipped. A call from who? Doesn't matter. He winked. The important thing is they confirmed your inheritance is worth a lot more than people realized. So that's why he was smiling. Not because he was happy for me. Because he believed he had finally found a way out. I walked inside without responding. He followed me into the kitchen. We need to celebrate. I've had a long day. It'll only take a minute. He pulled 2 glasses from the cabinet. I've already started making plans. I turned slowly. What kind of plans? He smiled as though the answer were obvious. Pay off the business. Expand. Buy a better house. Maybe a vacation place near the coast. Every sentence began with we. Not once did he ask me what I wanted. Not once did he ask how I felt about my grandmother. Not once did he mention honoring the woman whose lifetime of sacrifice had made any of this possible. He simply assumed her final gift belonged to him. I set my purse on the counter. I met with Julia today. I figured. What exactly did someone tell you? He hesitated for the first time. Oh, just that the estate was substantial. Who called? A friend. What friend? You wouldn't know him. I waited. He looked away. That was answer enough. Someone had leaked information he was never supposed to receive. Or perhaps he'd spent weeks trying to uncover it himself. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. There are a few things you should know, I said calmly. He leaned against the counter, smiling confidently. I'm listening. You tried to use my inheritance as collateral. The smile disappeared. What? I have copies of the applications. His face lost color. You went through my paperwork? The bank did. He opened his mouth and then closed it. Then laughed nervously. It wasn't like that. No? I was thinking about our future. Our future doesn't begin with your signature on documents I never approved. He rubbed the back of his neck. I was going to tell you. When? After everything went through. So after I unknowingly became responsible for your debt? His voice hardened. You're making this sound worse than it is. I stared at him. Worse? I've spent years paying your overdue loans. He blinked. What? I negotiated with creditors. Silence. I paid your credit cards. His eyes widened. I covered your business accounts. He looked genuinely confused. No, I stopped lawsuits before they reached our front door. His lips parted. You, what? I used my savings. I paused. And every time I thought I had nothing left, my grandmother quietly replaced the money because she knew what I was doing. He sat down slowly. I don't believe you. I reached into my purse and placed copies of bank transfers, payment receipts, and settlement letters on the table. One after another. Month after month. Year after year. His hands shook as he turned the pages. His voice cracked. I never knew. No. You never asked. The room became unbearably quiet. For the first time since we'd met, Spencer had nothing to say. Then he whispered, Why would you do all this? I looked at him for a long moment. Because I loved you. Those words hurt more than anything else I'd spoken that day. Because they belonged to the woman I used to be. Not the woman standing there now. A knock at the front door broke the silence. Spencer frowned. Are you expecting someone? No. He opened the door. 2 men stood outside. One introduced himself politely. Mr. Bradford? Yes. We're here regarding the outstanding commercial judgment entered against you. Spencer's face drained of color. I told my attorney. You've been notified several times. The second man handed him another packet. We're serving notice of collection proceedings. I watched from the hallway. Neither man looked at me. My name wasn't on the documents. My grandmother had made sure of that. After they left, Spencer closed the door slowly. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. He turned toward me. I need your help. Those 4 words echoed through the house. For years, I had waited to hear them. Not because I wanted power. Because I wanted honesty. Instead, they arrived only after every escape route had disappeared. I picked up my grandmother's letter from the kitchen table. I did help you. For years. You just never noticed. He reached toward me. Abby, please. I stepped back. No. You don't understand. I finally do. Tears filled his eyes. I'll lose everything. I nodded. I know exactly what that feels like. He stared at me, searching for the woman who would quietly fix another disaster. She wasn't there anymore. The next morning, I met Julia one final time. Every document transferring my grandmother's estate into my name had been completed. The investments remained untouched. The farmhouse was mine. Every decision was mine. Julia smiled. Your grandmother left me one final instruction. What was it? She said. Julia unfolded a small handwritten note. Tell Abby that an inheritance is not measured by what someone leaves behind. It's measured by the strength they leave within you. I closed my eyes as tears rolled down my cheeks. For the first time since she died, I wasn't grieving. I was grateful. 3 months later, I filed for divorce. I didn't ask for revenge. I didn't ask the court to punish Spencer beyond what the law required. I simply asked for my freedom. The debts he created remained his responsibility. The inheritance my grandmother built remained protected. I restored the old farmhouse instead of selling it. The cast iron skillet Spencer once mocked hangs proudly in my kitchen today. Every Sunday, I cook the same chicken pot pie my grandmother taught me to make when I was 15. Whenever friends gather around my table, I think about the lesson she spent her entire life teaching without ever saying the words aloud. People who truly love you never measure your worth by what you own, and people who mock what they think is small often reveal how empty they are inside. Spencer believed wealth meant control. My grandmother knew wealth meant peace. In the end, he was left with debts no one could pay for him, and I was left with something far more valuable than money. I was finally free. Before you go, let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Abigail's shoes? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. And remember, sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money at all. It's the courage to walk away from the people who never deserved your loyalty.